Today is Juneteenth, and every channel on YouTube is going to tell you the same story. General Granger arrives in Galveston. He reads the order. 250,000 enslaved people learn they're free. Celebration, joy, the end. But that's not the end. That's where the real story begins. And that story is the one they never tell. Because what happened the day after Juneteenth and the weeks, months, and years that followed is one of the most devastating chapters in American history. And it was buried on purpose. Slaveholders who refused to let go, freed people murdered for trying to leave plantations, laws passed within months that recreated slavery under a different name, a promise of 40 acres and a mule, stolen back by a president who sided with the Confederacy. And in 1903, 38 years after Juneteenth, a black man walked into an office in Texas still asking if slavery had ended. That's not a typo. 38 years, and he was still enslaved. You know the celebration. Today I'm going to show you what came after it. And once you see it, you will never look at Juneteenth the same way again. I have started a WhatsApp channel where I share the history YouTube suppresses. The link is in the pinned comment. Join now, because this is the Juneteenth story nobody else will tell you. Let's start with what actually happened on June 19th, 1865. Because even the celebration itself wasn't what you've been told. General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston with 2,000 Union troops. He stood on the balcony of Ashton Villa and read General Order Number 3, declaring that all enslaved people in Texas were free by executive decree of the President of the United States. But here's what they leave out. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued 2.5 years earlier on January 1st, 1863. Texas had been ignoring it the entire time. Why? Because there weren't enough Union soldiers in Texas to enforce it. And slaveholders knew that a law without enforcement is just words on paper. Even after Granger's announcement, enforcement was almost non-existent. 2,000 soldiers to cover an entire state. Plantations spread across hundreds of thousands of square miles of territory. Most enslaved people in rural Texas never saw a Union soldier. They heard about freedom through whispers, through travelers, through the rare arrival of a military patrol weeks or months after the announcement. And many slaveholders simply refused to comply. Some didn't tell their enslaved workers at all. They withheld the information deliberately, waiting until after the harvest season to squeeze one final crop of free labor out of people who were legally free but had no way of knowing it. Others told their workers and then threatened them, making it clear that leaving the plantation meant violence or death. Historian Henry Louis Gates, Jr. documented this directly. He wrote that free people who took it upon themselves to leave plantations often faced violent punishment, including murder, for what their former owners called transgressions. Freedom was announced from a balcony in Galveston. But on the plantations of East Texas, West Texas, and the Cotton Belt, slavery continued, not because it was legal, but because nobody was there to stop it. And the most haunting evidence of this comes from a single documented case. In 1903, 38 years after Juneteenth, a black man walked into an office in a small Texas town and asked whether slavery had ended. He had been forced to labor without pay for nearly 4 decades after the day that was supposed to set him free. 38 years of stolen life, after freedom had already been declared. Now here's where the story turns from tragic to criminal. Because even for the freed people who did learn about their freedom and did manage to leave, the system was already being rebuilt to trap them. In 1866, just 1 year after Juneteenth, the Texas state legislature passed what became known as the Black Codes. And these laws were designed with surgical precision to recreate the conditions of slavery without using the word. The vagrancy laws made it illegal for a free person to be unemployed. If you didn't have a job, and in a state that had just freed 250,000 people with no land, no money, no education, and no infrastructure, you could be arrested. And once arrested, you could be leased out to a private employer, often your former slaveholder, as convict labor. Read that again. A freed person could be arrested for not having a job, then forced to work for no pay on the same plantation they had just been freed from, under the supervision of the same person who had owned them. This was legal, this was policy. This was what Texas built in the first 12 months after Juneteenth. The apprenticeship laws were even more targeted. They allowed courts to take black children of freed people, and assign them as apprentices to white employers. The preferred employer by law was the former slaveholder. Black parents had their children taken from them by the court and handed to the people who had enslaved them, and it was called apprenticeship. The labor contract laws required free people to sign annual contracts with white employers. Breaking a contract meant forfeiting all wages for the year. Leaving a job before the contract ended meant arrest. The contracts were structured so that the worker was perpetually in debt, charged for food, housing, and tools at inflated prices that consumed their entire wage. This would later evolve into sharecropping, the system that trapped black families in debt bondage for the next century. The black codes also prohibited black Texans from voting, serving on juries, testifying against white people in court, or holding public office. Freedom had been declared, but citizenship had not. These were not rogue laws passed by extremists. These were enacted by the official state legislature of Texas in 1866. They were designed, debated, voted on, and signed into law by elected officials who understood exactly what they were doing, rebuilding slavery inside the legal framework of freedom. If this is making your blood boil, good. Join our WhatsApp channel because I go deeper there. The link is in the pinned comment. Tap it now. And then came the cruelest betrayal of all. During the final months of the Civil War, General William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15. It set aside 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land along the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to be redistributed to formerly enslaved families. Each family would receive 40 acres. The Army would lend them mules. It was the most significant act of economic justice for freed people in American history. Roughly 40,000 freed people settled on this land. They built homes, they planted crops, they started schools. They created communities from nothing on land that had been taken from the people who had enslaved them and given to the people who had worked it for free. And then Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson became president. Johnson was a Southerner, a Democrat, a man who had owned enslaved people himself. And one of his first major acts as president was to reverse Sherman's order. He pardoned former Confederate landowners and returned their confiscated property, the same land that 40,000 freed families had already settled on. Imagine that. You escaped slavery, you survived the war, you were given land legally by military order. You built a home, you planted your first crop as a free person, and then the President of the United States handed your land back to the man who had owned you. 40 acres and a mule. The most famous broken promise in American history. And it wasn't just a promise that was never kept. It was a promise that was actively, deliberately reversed by a president who chose the Confederacy over the people the Confederacy had enslaved. Johnson didn't just fail free people, he betrayed them. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau extension. He pardoned Confederate leaders and allowed them to regain political power across the South. The brief window of possibility that opened on Juneteenth, the window where freedom might have meant real freedom, with land, with resources, with protection, was slammed shut by the man sitting in the chair Lincoln had occupied. And behind all of the laws, behind the black codes and the stolen land and the rigged contracts, there was violence. Constant, systematic, relentless violence. In the months and years after Juneteenth, free people across the South were murdered in staggering numbers. The Ku Klux Klan formed in 1866, the same year the black codes were passed. And their purpose was explicit: to terrorize freed black people into submission. Black churches were burned, Black schools were destroyed. Black voters were murdered at polling stations. Black families who attempted to buy land, start businesses, or assert any form of independence were attacked in the night by men in white hoods who faced no consequences. In 1866, white mobs massacred dozens of black people in Memphis, Tennessee, burning entire neighborhoods and killing indiscriminately. That same year, a mob attacked a Republican political gathering in New Orleans, killing over 30 black people and white allies. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the enforcement mechanism. The Black Code set the legal framework. The violence enforced it. And the federal government, the same government that had sent Granger to Galveston to announce freedom, gradually withdrew. Federal troops were pulled out of the South. The Freedmen's Bureau was underfunded and eventually shuttered. And by 1877, just 12 years after Juneteenth, Reconstruction was officially over. Federal protection for freed people ended, and the South was handed back to the same men who had fought a war to keep black people enslaved. Jim Crow replaced the Black Codes. Sharecropping replaced plantation slavery. Lynching replaced the whip. And the promise of Juneteenth, the promise that freedom had finally come, was broken so completely that its effects are still measured in every economic statistic, every incarceration rate, and every educational disparity in America today. Even the celebration itself was attacked. When freed people in Houston tried to organize the first Juneteenth celebration in 1866, the city's newly enacted segregation laws blocked them from using any public parks. They were free, but they couldn't celebrate their freedom in a public space. So they pooled $800, an enormous sum for people who owned nothing, and bought 10 acres of land. They named it Emancipation Park. And they celebrated there on their own terms, on their own ground, because America wouldn't give them a single acre to stand on. That park still exists today. It stands as proof that free people didn't wait for justice to be given. They built it themselves with nothing from nothing against everything. Today is Juneteenth, and 250,000 people learned they were free on this day in 1865. But freedom without land is homelessness. Freedom without protection is vulnerability. Freedom without justice is a word on a piece of paper. And what came after Juneteenth, the Black Codes, the stolen land, the vagrancy arrests, the convict leasing, the apprenticeship kidnapping, the lynchings, the withdrawal of federal troops, and the rise of Jim Crow, proved that America never intended for freedom to be real. They announced it from a balcony. Then they spent the next 160 years making sure it did not mean what it was supposed to mean. 38 years after Juneteenth, a black man in Texas was still asking if slavery had ended. And in many ways, through mass incarceration, through the wealth gap, through voter suppression, through educational inequality, the system that was built the day after Juneteenth is still operating today. So today, when you celebrate, celebrate. Honor the ancestors who heard those words and dared to believe them. Honor the people who pooled $800 to buy their own park because America wouldn't let them stand on public ground. But also remember what came next. Because the fight that started the day after Juneteenth is the same fight we're in right now. And the only way to win it is to know the full story, not just the part they put on the calendar. Share this video with everyone. Send it to someone who thinks Juneteenth was a happy ending, because it wasn't an ending at all. It was the beginning of a war that's still being fought. Subscribe, hit the like, drop a comment and tell me, did you know what happened after Juneteenth? Because now you do, and you can never unknow it. I'll see you in the next one.